every shot fired tells a tale. Subscribe today and uncover the legends of the Wild West. The Nevada desert is a place that does not forgive weakness. Under the relentless sun, the earth cracks like an old man's skin, and the wind sweeps across the basins and ranges with a mournful howl. To the outsider, it looks empty, barren, lifeless. But those who have lived in its shadow know that the desert is never silent. The land remembers. It holds its stories in stone, in dust, and in whispers that ride the wind at dusk. In the 19th century, as the Wild West came alive with prospectors, outlaws, and cattlemen, another kind of tale haunted the dry valleys of Nevada. It was not about gold or gunfights, but about something far older, far stranger. Among the Paiute people, who had called this land home for generations, there lived a story of giants. Giants with flaming red hair who were said to have hunted, killed, and even eaten their ancestors. The Paiute had a name for them, Si-Te-Cah, which some say meant tule eaters, though their appetites were far more terrifying than reeds or roots. According to tribal lore, the Si-Te-Cah were monstrous in size, strong enough to tear a man in two, and cruel beyond measure. They raided Paiute camps, snatched children in the night, and left only bones behind. Their most chilling feature was their hair, long, thick, and the color of fire. To the Paiute, they were not simply men, but a race of cannibals who deserved no mercy. Stories told of war between the Paiute and these giants. Battles raged across the valleys with stone clubs and spears striking in the dust. The Paiute warriors fought desperately, but for years they could not defeat the Si-Te-Cah outright. At last, the elders say, the Paiute gathered their strength and cornered the giants in a great cave. While the Si-Te-Cah roared and hurled stones from inside, the Paiute piled brush and set it alight. Smoke filled the cavern, choking those trapped within. The giants refused to surrender, so the Paiute sealed the entrance with fire, ash, and rock, burying the monsters alive. The desert became their tomb. Generations later, the story remained alive in Paiute families. One of the most well-known keepers of that memory was Sarah Winnemucca, the daughter of a Paiute chief and a fierce advocate for her people in the turbulent years of frontier expansion. In her 1883 book, Life Among the Paiutes, Their Wrongs and Claims, she wrote down the stories she had heard as a child, stories her grandfather told as if they had happened only yesterday. The Si-Te-Cah were not a fairy tale to her. They were part of the living history of her people, a reminder of survival in a land where every mistake meant death. But while the Paiute carried these legends with reverence, the newcomers to Nevada, the miners, ranchers, and wandering drifters, treated them as nothing more than campfire curiosities. In the saloons of Virginia City or the dusty inns of Lovelock, men laughed over whiskey at the idea of red-haired giants. Tall tales, they called them, no different from the stories of Paul Bunyan or Pecos Bill. These men had come west to wrest gold from the earth, to stake cattle claims, or to carve their names in the lawless frontier. Myths of monsters had no place in their ledgers. Yet even among skeptics, rumors lingered. Prospectors sometimes whispered about finding arrowheads larger than their hands. A rancher claimed to discover human bones near the Humboldt River far too large to belong to any ordinary man. Hunters swore they tracked footprints in the desert sand, prints longer than a man's boot and wider than his palm. One traveling preacher even told his congregation that he had seen strands of red hair snagged on a canyon wall, glowing in the sunlight like copper wire. Most dismissed such stories, but they were never forgotten. The Wild West thrived on legends, after all. Every mining camp had its ghost stories, every trail had its outlaws, and every saloon echoed with the sound of tall tales. Still, the whispers about Nevada's giants carried a different weight. They were not simply invented to pass the time. They were rooted in something older, something that the desert itself seemed unwilling to let go. By the end of the 19th century, the story of the red-haired giants had become part of the strange folklore of the West. But it was a folklore on the brink of change. The railroad was carving through the state, new towns were springing up, and industry was turning untamed desert into farmland and mines. Yet there remained one place that seemed untouched by time: a sandstone cave near the small town of Lovelock. To most, Lovelock Cave was unremarkable, just another dusty hole in the rock. Locals knew it mainly as a nesting place for bats, a place that reeked of guano. But among the Paiute, its reputation was darker. Some said this was the very cave where their ancestors had sealed the last of the giants. Children were warned not to go near. And when the desert wind whistled across its entrance, some swore they could hear cries inside, echoes of the trapped Si-Te-Cah. In the spring of 1904, a Paiute elder named Si-Te-Cah, a name lost in most records though remembered in tribal oral history, told a visiting rancher that the cave was cursed. "That is where the giants sleep," he warned, "and if you wake them, you will not live to see the sun." The rancher laughed it off, but years later, when guano miners entered the cave in 1911, those words would seem prophetic. For now, in this first part of our tale, the giants remained locked in memory, straddling the line between myth and truth. Settlers debated, newspapers occasionally printed strange accounts, and Paiute elders continued to remind their children of the monsters their people had defeated long ago. The desert kept its secrets, but it never erased them. And so, the stage was set. The whispers of the Si-Te-Cah were drifting across Nevada, carried by wind and firelight. Soon, men with picks and shovels would uncover something inside Lovelock Cave, something that would make even the skeptics pause, if only for a moment, and wonder if the legends were more than just stories. Because in Nevada's Wild West, the line between myth and reality was as thin as the desert horizon at dusk. The year was 1911, and the town of Lovelock, Nevada, was hardly more than a scattering of dusty buildings and stubborn people clinging to life on the edge of the desert. Trains roared through from Reno, carrying miners, gamblers, and drifters, but the town itself was small, sleepy, and easy to forget. Yet just beyond its borders lay a cave that no one could forget once they stepped inside. At first glance, Lovelock Cave was nothing more than a hollow carved into the hillside, dark and unwelcoming, its mouth yawning like a wound in the sandstone. Locals avoided it. The Paiute spoke of it in hushed tones, warning children to keep away. Ranchers claimed bats flew out in such swarms at dusk that the sky seemed to ripple. But for two men, David Pugh and James Hart, both guano miners, the cave represented money. Guano, the droppings of countless bats, was valuable. Farmers paid good cash for it as fertilizer, and in those years before chemical alternatives became common, a cave filled with the stuff was a treasure trove. When Pugh and Hart secured rights to dig the Lovelock Cave, they weren't thinking about giants or legends or curses. They were thinking about profit. The two men hauled sacks of guano out by the ton, the ammonia stench clinging to their clothes and skin. They worked by lantern light, their picks striking into layers that had built up over centuries. For days, it was monotonous, filthy labor. Then, one afternoon, as Pugh swung his pick into a hardened section near the back of the cave, the earth gave way with a hollow crack. What spilled out was not guano. It was bone. At first, the miners thought they had struck an animal burial, but the more they dug, the more impossible it became to dismiss. Human skulls, long femurs, and fragments of bodies tumbled into the lantern light, and among them were strands of hair, dried and brittle, yet still holding a strange reddish hue, like rusted copper. Hart stared at one skull, holding it in his rough hands. "Too damn big," he muttered. The cranium was massive, broader than any man's head he'd seen. The jaw was heavy, the teeth thick. When they uncovered a leg bone that measured longer than Hart's entire arm, the two men exchanged a look. They were not educated, not scientists, but they knew what was normal, and this was not. Word spread quickly. By the time the miners had hauled their first wagon load into town, Lovelock was buzzing. In the saloon, ranch hands and prospectors crowded around Pugh as he recounted what they'd seen. "Bones big as a horse's leg," he swore, "and hair red as fire, like the Paiute stories say." The bartender chuckled, pouring shots, but even he leaned closer, caught between disbelief and fascination. When the Paiute elders heard the news, their reaction was not surprise, but grim acknowledgment. "The Si-Te-Cah," one old man said, shaking his head. "The cave has given them back." For the Paiute, this was proof of what they had always known, that their ancestors' war with the red-haired giants was no myth. Soon, scientists and officials were drawn to the cave. Among them was Alfred Gruber, a respected anthropologist from the University of California, Berkeley. Gruber and his team began cataloging artifacts found among the guano: finely woven baskets, stone tools, and most astonishing of all, duck decoys carved from reeds, some of the oldest ever discovered in North America. But it was not the baskets or the decoys that captured public imagination. It was the bones. The scientists examined the remains, carefully measuring and recording. Some bones, they concluded, may have belonged to unusually tall individuals, perhaps over 7 feet. Yet others seemed to match ordinary human sizes. The reddish hair, they argued, might have been dark originally and simply faded due to centuries of chemical exposure in the cave. Their reports leaned toward caution, careful not to fuel the sensational rumors already catching fire in newspapers. But rumors need little fuel to burn. Across Nevada and beyond, headlines appeared: "Red-haired giants unearthed in cave. Nevada miners find race of giants. Skeletons of cannibals found in desert tomb." Each retelling grew larger, stranger, more dramatic. Soon the giants were described as 10 feet tall, their skulls monstrous, their appetite for human flesh undeniable. In the saloons and back rooms, the story became a kind of frontier theater. Men swore they had heard from a friend of a friend that entire skeletons had been pulled out, standing 9 feet tall. Women whispered that the miners had angered the dead, that spirits of the Si-Te-Cah now haunted the cave. Children dared each other to walk near its mouth after sunset, claiming they heard growls echoing inside. Among the scientists, however, tension brewed. Some believed the bones had been mishandled, mixed with animal remains, or exaggerated by eager miners looking for fame. Others quietly admitted that certain finds defied easy explanation. And then there were the missing bones. Rumors persisted that several of the largest skulls had been shipped to San Francisco, never to be displayed or mentioned again. Conspiracy theorists would later argue that the Smithsonian Institution deliberately suppressed evidence of giants to preserve conventional history. Whether true or not, the idea of a cover-up only deepened the mystery. Meanwhile, the Paiute watched with unease. For them, this was not entertainment or scandal. This was sacred history unearthed without respect. One elder told a young reporter, "They laughed at us. They said we told children's tales. But now they dig where they should not, and they see what we told them." As the months passed, Lovelock Cave became a strange sort of attraction. Adventurers, treasure hunters, and amateur archaeologists journeyed to Nevada, hoping to glimpse a giant's skull or hold a relic in their hands. The cave itself, stripped of guano, stood half empty, its walls scarred with pick marks. Yet, for all the digging, no one ever uncovered a complete skeleton. Only fragments, scattered and partial as though the earth itself refused to give up the whole truth. But the legend had already escaped the cave. It drifted across Nevada like desert dust, impossible to contain. Were the Paiute vindicated at last? Or had the miners' discovery merely fed into a frenzy of myth-making that blurred the line between fact and folklore? In the end, Lovelock Cave offered more questions than answers. And as night fell over the desert, lanterns flickered in the saloon windows of Lovelock, where men and women leaned close, whispering about the red-haired giants that once walked the Wild West. Some swore it was nonsense, others believed every word, and a few, after a glass too many, wondered aloud if perhaps, just perhaps, not all of the Si-Te-Cah had perished in that cave after all, because the desert does not give up its secrets easily, and in Nevada, secrets have a way of walking in the shadows, waiting to be found again. By 1912, the story of the red-haired giants had grown too large for Nevada to contain. Newspapers from San Francisco to New York carried sensational headlines, each one stretching the tale further than the last. "Skeletons 10 feet tall, found in Nevada cave," shouted one. Another promised cannibal race of giants unearthed in the desert. For the public, it was thrilling. A frontier ghost story made flesh. But for scientists, it was an embarrassment. At the University of California, Berkeley, Alfred Kruber, head of the anthropology department, sat at his desk sifting through reports from Lovelock. A stern, meticulous man, Kruber had little patience for sensationalism. To him, archaeology was a science, not a circus. The artifacts from the cave were extraordinary, yes. The woven baskets, nets, and duck decoys revealed an ancient culture of astonishing skill. But giants? He frowned at the thought. "These men are guano miners, not trained excavators," Kruber told his assistant. "Bones scattered, mishandled, perhaps even mixed with animal remains. A 7-foot man is unusual, but not impossible. Beyond that, the rest is campfire talk." Yet, even as he dismissed the rumors, pressure grew. Locals demanded to know why the scientists weren't acknowledging what was plain as day. Paiute elders insisted the finds validated their oral history of the Si-Te-Cah, the red-haired giants their ancestors had fought, and in Lovelock, miners like David Pugh were only too happy to embellish their accounts. In the saloon, Pugh became a kind of folk hero, his voice carrying over clinking glasses. "I seen a skull this big," he'd roar, spreading his calloused hands wide, "and hair red as sunset. Don't let those professors tell you otherwise." For ordinary townsfolk, the scientists were outsiders, strangers who swooped in with clipboards and theories, too proud to admit they might be wrong. For the scientists, the locals were storytellers eager for fame. The clash was inevitable. One evening in Reno, a public lecture turned into a showdown. Kruber, invited to present his findings, stood before a restless audience. He spoke of carbon layers, stratigraphy, and the cultural value of the duck decoys. But as he droned on, hands shot up. "What about the giant bones?" a rancher barked. "Yes, the skulls," cried another. "My cousin swears he saw one as big as a pumpkin wagon." Kruber sighed. "Exaggerations. The largest remains we've measured suggest individuals perhaps 6.5 to 7 feet tall. Uncommon, yes. Giants, no." The murmurs turned hostile. From the back, an old Paiute woman rose, her voice steady. "You may measure bones, but you do not measure stories. My grandmother told me of the Si-Te-Cah, red-haired, taller than any man. You call this a myth. I call it memory." The room fell silent. Even Kruber had no reply. Meanwhile, whispers circulated about missing evidence. Some claimed that the largest skulls had been quietly shipped to the Smithsonian, where they vanished into the institution's endless archives. Officially, no such specimens were ever recorded. Unofficially, the rumors only grew. Conspiracy theorists argued that a deliberate cover-up was underway, that the government feared rewriting the history of North America. By 1924, L. Loud, another Berkeley anthropologist, published a detailed report of the Lovelock excavations. His findings were cautious, couched in academic language. He described the artifacts as invaluable, the remains as intriguing but inconclusive. To the scientific community, it was a model of professionalism. To the public, it was a disappointment. Where were the giants? Where was the proof that the Paiute legends were real? In Lovelock, locals mocked the report. "All them fancy words just to say they don't believe their own eyes," muttered James Hart. Even decades later, townsfolk would swear the scientists had seen the truth and buried it under paperwork. And yet, beyond the noise, something deeper lingered. The artifacts themselves refused to vanish into obscurity. The duck decoys, carefully preserved, were displayed in museums as some of the oldest known in the Americas. The woven sandals and ropes revealed a people with advanced skills. Whoever lived in Lovelock Cave centuries ago, they were not primitive. They were innovators, survivors of the desert's cruelty. But for many, the question remained: who were they? To the Paiute, the answer was clear. The cave had been the final refuge of the Si-Te-Cah, the red-haired giants driven into the darkness and burned alive by their ancestors. The bones were proof, and the scientists' refusal to admit it was just another insult in a long line of dismissals. For generations, their stories had been ridiculed as fantasy. Now, even with physical remains, the experts demanded more evidence. For the scientists, the answer was also clear. The remains belonged to an ancient Native American culture, distinct but human, nothing supernatural or mythical. Claims of giants were born from exaggeration, wishful thinking, or outright fabrication. In their eyes, the legends were valuable, but as folklore, not as fact. Between these two truths, the divide widened, and as the decades rolled on, the legend only grew. Writers of the 1940s and 50s turned the Lovelock Giants into pulp magazine fodder. By the 1970s, the tale had entered the world of fringe archaeology, cited by authors who argued that North America's history was far stranger than textbooks admitted. In modern times, the story leapt online, filling blogs, podcasts, and YouTube videos. For every skeptic citing the scientific reports, a believer countered with whispers of cover-ups, missing bones, and silenced truths. What began in a dusty cave in Nevada had become something larger than science, larger than folklore. It had become a cultural battlefield, where belief and evidence wrestled endlessly. Yet the cave remained, silent and watchful. Visitors could still climb the rocky slope, stand at its dark mouth, and feel the desert wind whistle through. Some claimed they could sense a presence inside, the weight of history pressing down. Others said they heard nothing but the squeak of bats. Still, the question lingered in the air, unanswered. Were the Paiute legends merely stories? Or did the red-haired giants truly walk the Wild West? The scientists had spoken. The Paiute had spoken. The miners, too. But the cave, as always, kept its secrets. By the time the 1930s rolled around, Lovelock Cave was no longer just a hole in the desert. It was a legend, an open wound in Nevada's history, bleeding questions that refused to clot. The scientists had published their reports, dry and technical, leaving no room for giants. But the townsfolk whispered otherwise. Over whiskey and poker games in the Lovelock saloon, the story grew taller with each telling. Miners claimed that the largest skulls had been carted off by government men in dark suits. Ranchers swore that entire skeletons, too large to be human, had been hidden away in crates marked fragile and shipped east on dusty trains. "Smithsonian took 'em," muttered James Hart, his eyes narrowing as if daring anyone to deny it. "That's what they do. Anything that don't fit the history books, they bury it. Mark my words." To the conspiracy-minded, it was the perfect cover-up. The Smithsonian institution was vast, powerful, and beyond the reach of ordinary men. Who would ever know if a few bones vanished into its endless vaults? Meanwhile, Paiute elders continued to press their case. In smoky kitchens and family gatherings, they told younger generations that the white men feared the truth. Mary Winnemucca's words, long since written down, were repeated like scripture. The Si-Te-Cah were real. My people drove them into the cave. We burned them there, and the bones you see now are their bones. For the Paiute, this wasn't myth. It was memory, and memory does not fade because a professor says otherwise. The tension simmered for decades. Then, in the 1960s, it boiled over. Enter Don Monroe, a big game hunter and adventurer with a taste for the mysterious. Monroe had heard the Lovelock whispers since boyhood, and by middle age he decided to see for himself. Armed with cameras, notebooks, and a restless determination, he scoured the cave and its surroundings. Monroe claimed he discovered bones unlike any he'd ever seen. A jawbone, he said, too large to fit a normal human skull. Teeth that looked made for a man twice the size of any he'd hunted beside. He showed them to locals, took photographs, and insisted they were real. Some believed him, others scoffed, but Monroe didn't care. He was chasing shadows, and in Nevada, shadows had teeth. He wasn't alone. By the 1970s, fringe archaeologists and writers of the unexplained had taken up the Lovelock story. Paperbacks with lurid covers appeared on shelves. Giants of the American West, Secrets of the Desert Races. Each one repeated the claims, giant skeletons found, stolen, hidden, and each one pointed a finger at the Smithsonian. Why, they asked, would a national museum suppress such finds? The answer, they argued, was obvious. The truth would shatter the narrative of American history, proving that another race, an ancient, unknown people, had walked the land before. Mainstream archaeologists dismissed this as nonsense. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, they said. Yet evidence, inconveniently, seemed always just out of reach. Photographs were grainy, bones disappeared, witnesses died, and then came the wildest rumor of all. In 1976, a trucker named Bill Sanderson swore he had seen a government convoy leaving Lovelock in the dead of night. 3 trucks, unmarked, their cargo covered with tarps. Big crates, he told anyone who'd listen. Big enough to hold coffins, or bigger. When asked what proof he had, Sanderson just shook his head. Proof, he said. Proof is gone the minute they drive away. The story spread like wildfire. Soon, even people who had never set foot in Nevada spoke knowingly of the Lovelock cover-up. Radio hosts leaned into the mystery. Authors turned speculation into bestsellers. By the 1990s, the Internet gave the tale a new life, with forums buzzing over blurry photographs of supposed giant skulls, most of them proven fakes, but none less compelling to the faithful. Yet, beneath the noise, the cave itself remained. Visitors spoke of strange feelings inside, of standing in that dark chamber and imagining screams echoing against stone as flames consumed the Si-Te-Cah. A few swore they heard whispers, like voices trapped in the rock. Skeptics chalked it up to acoustics, but the believers needed no convincing. In time, Lovelock Cave became more than a site. It became a symbol. To some, it stood for the arrogance of science, unwilling to accept what didn't fit neatly into its charts. To others, it stood for the gullibility of the public, too eager to believe in fairy tales. To the Paiute, it was something else entirely, proof that their stories had weight, that their ancestors' voices still spoke through the desert dust. And through it all, the shadow of conspiracy loomed. The Smithsonian, for its part, denied everything. "We have no record of giant skeletons from Lovelock Cave," their spokesman repeated, decade after decade, but denials only fed the fire. After all, why would a great institution admit to hiding the truth? In bars, in books, in late-night radio, the tale of the missing bones only grew larger. Some swore the remains had been taken for secret military experiments, others that they were hidden to protect biblical narratives. A few even claimed the giants were not human at all but remnants of a race that predated man, an ancient species, wiped out, its story erased. Fact or fiction, the story refused to die. By the dawn of the 21st century, the Lovelock Giants had become immortal, not in flesh, but in legend. They lived in the uneasy space where history and myth collide, where cover-ups and conspiracies thrive. Every denial made them stronger. Every missing bone made them more real. And for those who climbed the dusty hills to stand at the cave's mouth, the question remained: what truly lay hidden in the darkness? Bones of ordinary men, twisted by time and tale, or the ashes of giants, erased by those too frightened to let the world know? The cave, as always, kept its silence, but the whispers never stopped. The Nevada desert has a way of holding on to secrets. Long after the miners left, after the scientists packed up their crates, after the rumors of missing bones filled bars and radio shows, the cave at Lovelock still crouched in silence under the endless sky. To the casual traveler, it was nothing but a dusty hole in a hillside. To those who knew its story, it was something far greater, a monument to a mystery that refused to die. By the early 21st century, the tale of the red-haired giants had leapt far beyond Nevada. It had become part of the mythology of the American West itself, an echo of frontier folklore as vivid as any gunslinger duel or lost mine. Tourists came from around the world, not for the guano or the baskets in museum glass, but to stand at the mouth of the cave and imagine giants within. Some took photographs of the dark interior, claiming later they saw strange shapes in the shadows. Others brought offerings, tobacco, beads, even whiskey, left quietly on the rocks, gifts to the restless spirits of the Si-Te-Cah. For the Paiute, the cave remained sacred ground. Elders spoke of it not as a curiosity, but as proof of their ancestors' struggle for survival. To them, the Lovelock story was not a conspiracy or a ghost tale. It was history, a memory burned into their identity. Their oral tradition held steady. The giants were real, they were enemies, and they were vanquished. Yet the broader world continued to wrestle with the story. Television crews filmed documentaries, blending archaeology with speculation. Authors churned out books arguing that Lovelock was evidence of a forgotten race, or even proof of biblical Nephilim. Online forums lit up with debates, some citing missing Smithsonian crates, others swearing the entire tale was nothing more than tall talk by miners eager for fame. Still, the mystery's endurance spoke to something deeper in the American imagination. The Wild West has always been a place where fact and fiction blur, where legends grow as tall as the mountains and as wide as the desert. Outlaws like Jesse James, lawmen like Wyatt Earp, gunslingers, buried treasures, all of them straddle the line between history and myth. The Lovelock Giants joined this pantheon, larger than life, haunting the desert with every whisper of wind. At the same time, science refused to bend. Archaeologists continued to publish measured papers pointing to radiocarbon dating and cultural continuity. They spoke of the northern Paiute people, ingenious hunter-gatherers whose artistry in basketry and hunting tools was undeniable. To them, there were no giants, only humans, as complex and creative as any others in history. But science cannot kill story, and Lovelock Cave is not just a site, it is a stage. On it play two visions of the past, one rooted in evidence, the other in belief. And in America, belief is a powerful thing. Consider this: in Lovelock today, locals still swap stories over coffee at diners. Some swear their grandfathers saw crates of enormous bones. Others claim the government men warned them to keep quiet. Young thrill-seekers hike to the cave at night, daring each other to enter, their flashlights shaking as bats scatter overhead. The desert swallows their laughter, adding it to a century of echoes. The legacy of the red-haired giants, then, is not about proving whether 10-foot skeletons once walked Nevada. It is about the way stories shape us. For the Paiute, it affirms identity. For conspiracy theorists, it confirms suspicion of authority. For adventurers, it promises that the frontier is not yet fully mapped. And for the rest of us, it is a reminder that the Wild West still has mysteries worth chasing. Because in the end, the truth of Lovelock Cave lies not only in bones or artifacts, but in imagination. Whether giants once lived there or not, their legend towers still, casting shadows longer than any man. The cave, quiet and unchanging, waits. And so does the question: will we ever know the truth? If you enjoyed this journey into the Wild West's strangest mystery, don't let the story end here. Subscribe to the channel for more tales of outlaws, legends, and the hidden history of America's frontier. Like this video if you love stories that blur the line between fact and folklore. And tell us in the comments, do you believe the red-haired giants of Lovelock were real? Or just another myth of the Wild West? Your voice keeps these legends alive, and together we'll keep riding deeper into the mysteries of history.